In the roles and permissions video, I mentioned briefly something called policies, and I told you that basically they just enable you to execute some extra logic along with your controllers. Let's go ahead and head on over to the Strapi documentation to learn a little bit more. I'm here on strapi.io at the left under concepts and then policies. They say that policies are functions that have the ability to execute specific logic on each request before it reaches a controller. They're mostly used for securing business logic easily. One of the most common use cases is an isAdmin, which makes sure that the request is sent by an admin user for any really important actions. There are two main types of policies. Okay, there are global policies, and then there are plugin or API policies. Okay, so a global policy is one that you can use to associate on any of your routes. So isAuthenticated is a built-in policy that we had seen when we checked out the roles and permissions, and that simply makes sure that there is a logged in user making the request. And that is a global policy because there's lots of places in your application where you might want to make sure that an authenticated user is making that request. To create a global policy, you can open up your code editor and you would go into the config folder, not of the article that we've been working with, so not inside of article config, but the main config folder for the backend. And inside of here, you would create a folder called policies. And then in here, you could go ahead and create all of the global policies that you'd like. I'm gonna go ahead and just delete that because we're not going to do that this time. We'll flip over back here. And then if you want to actually use a policy, you can activate it from the admin dashboard interface that we saw in the roles and permissions, where you can simply select from the drop-down here. We'll just go in and check it out. If you go in and select, say, the count, and then select isAuthenticated. So here are your policies that you could choose to attach to this. Or you can open up the routes.json and you can see here that there's a config and then policies array for each one where you could add the appropriate policies. Okay, so we'll go back to the documentation. So those are global policies that can be associated on any route, or you have scoped policies. And these are policies associated with the routes that they're defined on the API. So here, if you were to open up the code editor and go into our API and then the article folder and then into the config folder, here you would create another folder inside of here called policies. And then inside of that folder, you could define all of your policies for this specific content type. So we can see in the example that they provided, if we have in API/restaurant/config/policies/isAdmin.js containing the code here, checking for whether or not it's an administrator, then since it's already associated with the restaurant content type, inside of the routes, you simply have to add the name of the function for that policy, or actually the name of the file rather. So isAdmin.js is admin in the policies array. One thing that's important to note here is that you need this syntax if you're going to create your own policies. Okay, you need a module.exports equals async, accepting the context, the next, an arrow function, opening up, and then you need to make sure that at some point you call the return await next to go to the next policy or to the actual controller if there are no other policies. One thing they also want you to keep in mind is that the number of policies that you include on a specific endpoint is going to affect the performance of that endpoint, because every policy you add adds extra logic that needs to be executed and extra time that it will take for that request to be completed. So that's just something to keep in mind. Here at the bottom, it gives us an example of not only being able to, as we saw above, call the await next to go to our next controller, you can also use that to execute code after the controller. So not just a policy for logic executed before the request goes to a controller, but you can use a policy to execute logic after a request goes through a controller. Okay, so by putting this code block after the await next call, this code will be executed after the controller is executed. Okay, so I really think that this enables really powerful behavior, and it really provides us with a really easy mechanism for performing these sort of tasks, such as protecting routes. That is a really solid use case for this, and I'm sure you guys will think of plenty of other ones. So if you have any interesting ones, be sure to drop them in the comments below. You should really be starting to see just how much Strapi is doing for us and providing for us, and how really impressive I think it is as a framework to have all this functionality baked into one really impressive open source headless CMS. So let's keep going through our Strapi overview in the next video.